Good evening. Before we begin, I wanted to say a brief thank you to all of you. I realized probably this week, or at least it finally hit me, that this would be my last, at least for a while, service at Lighthouse. And I'll be leaving this coming weekend. As pastors mentioned, I'm getting married Saturday. Very excited about that. I'll be leaving Wednesday morning for that. So thank you for the 6 or so years that I've been here full-time. 4 of those were in college, but there was always a place to come home to. I appreciate your love, your prayers, everything that you've done, the opportunities to speak, the friendships, the discipleship, everything. So thank you very much. Thank you also for the gifts that you all laid out on the table and the cards for us, me and Casey, this afternoon. We appreciate that very much, and those will go a long way, I'm sure, with everything that a new couple needs in their new house. I'd like to take you tonight to the minor prophets, to the book of Haggai. Haggai is considered one of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. He lived during the time of the Babylonian exile. If you're wondering where Haggai is, it's toward the end of your Old Testament, in between Zephaniah and Zechariah. The 2 Z's, which is me. Haggai is right in the middle. We're all, to some extent, familiar with the exile that the Jews were put into for 70 years when they're taken captive to Babylon. You're familiar with characters such as Daniel and Zechariah and Ezra. Haggai is a contemporary. He lived right after that exile. He was one of the 50,000 or so first to return to Jerusalem after King Cyrus gave them freedom to go home. And today, to help set the historical context and hopefully to give you a better picture of the setting here in this time, I want us to figuratively hop into a time machine and go back and put ourselves in this time. I want you to imagine with me today that you are a Jew living during this time. You can close your eyes if you want to, or whatever helps you the most. But I want you to imagine that you are a Jew living in the year 536 BC, and you have just arrived home to your home city of Jerusalem after a long and wearisome captivity. Some of you are old enough to remember what Jerusalem looked like before the tragedy that was King Nebuchadnezzar's army invading your hometown and leveling the city, leaving it in ruins, including the temple. Some 70 years ago in the year 586. Some of you will remember the awesome beauty that was that temple. You remember the gold, you remember the silver, and maybe the big steps that led up. Remember the big pillars? You were taught as a kid that that's where God dwelled among his people. And that's where you would go to worship him. But you'll also remember being led away captive. And as a young child, turning back to see the horrific sight that was a large plume of smoke arising from your beloved home city, Jerusalem. The sight was heartbreaking. And even at your young age, you knew that this wasn't how it was supposed to be. Some of you are too young to have lived in Jerusalem. You were born and raised in the captivity in Babylon. But you've heard stories about God's great kingdom of Israel. You've heard about the enormous temple arrayed with gold and silver and beautiful jewels. And you've heard of God's mighty works of deliverance in your nation's history and the many years of prosperity and blessing that he gave to your nation. So now, 70 long years later, you have finally been freed. You are able to go home for the first time. God has worked on your behalf, your people's behalf again, and you can return to the city that you've only ever dreamed of or imagined. And after the long journey of nearly 900 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem, you finally see that city on a hill. But almost instantly, your heart sinks. You finally know for yourself the horrific sight that your fathers described. Jerusalem, God's holy city, is in ruins. There's nothing but broken charcoal brick in piles where houses and walls and the temple used to be. Your heart aches. But one thing that you do know is that you must rally your people to rebuild. God has given you the opportunity to put back together the pieces of the former glory this city held. You're going to rebuild God's temple, and He will dwell among you again. So you get to work. And quickly you have the foundation of the temple laid, and you begin to sacrifice at a new altar again. But almost as soon as you start, you find that your resources are depleted, and foreign opposition is already breathing down your neck. And so you give up. The work of rebuilding the temple comes to a standstill, and for almost 16 years, think about that, 16 long years, it lies in ruins as you build up the remainder of the city around it. So now, the date is August 29th, 520 BC. Times are hard economically, agriculturally, and most certainly spiritually. And you wonder why the Lord is not blessing you, why He's not giving you the prosperity that you've heard stories of in the past, and why He's allowing you to suffer. But then a prophet rises up, and his name is Haggai, and he brings this message from the Lord. Haggai chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie in waste? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, Consider your ways. Ye have sown much, and bring in little. Ye eat, but ye have not enough. Ye drink, but ye are not filled with drink. Ye clothe you, but there is none warm. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes. These people at this point are crippled in fear and in guilt and in shame as they turn to one direction and see their house, which has been very beautifully decorated and put up, and there's nice protection. And then they look the other direction and they see God's house, the temple that was supposed to be rebuilt 16 years ago. And it still lies in waste. There's only a foundation built. And soon they began to understand why they've struggled all these years. They prioritized their work over God's work. They built up their house and neglected His. The message from Haggai continues in verse 7. He says, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, again, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain and bring wood and build the house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, saith the Lord. You looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when ye brought it home, I did blow upon it. Why, saith the Lord of hosts? Because of my house that is in waste, and ye run every man unto his own house. Therefore the heaven under you is stayed from dew, and the earth is stayed from her fruit. And I called for a drought upon the land, and upon the mountains, and upon the corn, and upon the new wine, and upon the oil, and upon that which the ground bringeth forth, and upon men, and upon cattle, and upon all the labor of the hands. So for the people in Haggai's day, it all had become clear at this moment. For years they worked and worked, but every year they brought home less and less. The Lord uses an analogy of a bag with holes in it. You ever tried to put something into a pocket that has a hole in the bottom? And you go to reach for that thing and where'd it go? Little did you know, you found out that there was a hole in that pocket. And whatever it was, a quarter or $1 or your cell phone, whatever it was, it had fallen through the hole. How frustrating would that be? This is what was happening as people in this day were going out to gather the crops. They'd put them in bags, and when they brought it back to home, they'd look down at the bag and say, I could have promised you that I brought back more than this. I put way more into that bag than what I have here. But then they examine the bag and they find there's a huge hole in the bottom. This is the condition that the Lord is describing of these Israelite people. And the Lord says, you wonder why this has happened? It's because my house is lying in waste over there. When I told you to come back after your freedom and rebuild my temple, rebuild my house, but you started and stopped, and then you went on to build your own houses. You went on with your life and your work, but you forgot about mine. They had not put what should have been first. They had misplaced their priorities. Continue on with the message in verse 12. We see the response of the people. Verse 12, then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, with all the remnant of the people, obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent him. And the people did fear before the Lord. Then spake Haggai, the Lord's messenger, and the Lord's message unto the people, saying, I am with you, saith the Lord. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people, and they came and did work in the house of the Lord of hosts, their God, in the 4th and 20th day of the 6th month, in the 2nd year of King Darius. Now, if you notice something that's very interesting, if you read through the minor prophets, this is rare that the people have obeyed the voice of the Lord. Many times in the prophets, you find the prophet proclaiming the message that the Lord has brought to him, and the people say, no, we're okay. We've got this taken care of. We're all right. But then what happened? They ended up in 70 years of exile. So, you think they learned their lesson? In a way? So here we are, they're obeying the voice of the Lord, and they're getting to work. And they're rebuilding again. And folks, this is the message of the Lord for us today. The same message is for us some 2,500 years ago, later. And I'm afraid many of us today, and I'm not excluded, have put our selfish ambitions and purposes and plans and passions above the Lord's. I've heard it said that our passions are revealed by what we spend the most time on, or what we spend the most time pursuing. So in a way, we can say that this is what the Lord is saying to us. He's saying, verse 2, he's saying that it is not time, or it is not time to concern ourselves with what God has called us to do. Is that not what we say when we put God's passions beneath ours? We're saying, somebody else will do it. Somebody else will get to that. Somebody a lot smarter than me can do that job. You may not say that outwardly, but is that what our lifestyles often portray? We can go to church. We can say we love Jesus. We can sing all the songs. We can participate in the Lord's Supper even. We can pray along with the pastors. But we can still not really be a person who is passionate about God and putting His ways first. Fortunately, many of us become concerned with ourself and building our kingdom before we build God's kingdom. Israel at this point in history had forsaken the rebuilding of the temple, but they had not forsaken the rebuilding of the rest of the city. Look at verse 4. It says, "Is it time for you," this is the Lord speaking, "O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, as this house lie waste?" Now, it's not that God is saying it's a bad thing to have ceilings on your houses. That's okay. That's a good thing. Modern day equivalents would be maybe having, waxed floors, wainscoting, chrome kitchens. Now, these things aren't bad, but if you have these things to the neglect of God's work in your life and what He's passionate about, then that's where we have the issue. And I think that's where many of us get caught up. And maybe if it's not even, our physical houses, this could be our lifestyles. What we do on a daily basis, what we're building in our own lives. Is it following God's plan for your life? Then check out the end of verse 9. He's responding why He sent this famine. He sent the holy bags, you could say. It says, "Why, saith the Lord," at the end of verse 9, "because my house is waste, and you run every man unto his own house." It's like He's saying, you people see that my house is lying in waste. My house is in rubbles. But you turn the other way and run to your own house. And you're excited to get a project done at your own house. But every day you still walk by the temple and see that it's still in ruins and needs to be worked on. Oh, but I got to go finish that deck at home. I got to finish putting new carpet in, is what they're saying. They're running everyone to their own house first before they're running to God's house. It's like running rather to Home Depot or to Lowe's to pick up the tools and the hardware for your new home project. I can relate to this personally. It's kind of a simple and cheesy illustration. This past semester, I guess it would have been this fall semester, I can't remember. Senior year flew by. I fell in love for a week or so with building wooden canvas frames. I had found something really neat online that I wanted to put up in my room. It was a Star Wars picture. I'm a big fan of Star Wars. And it was on canvas, so I needed to get the wood frames. And it was one of those canvases that it came on multiple, it needed multiple canvas frames. It wasn't like one big picture. It was like 5 smaller pictures that you put together and it makes one big picture. So I had ordered that picture, and I ran out to Home Depot and I bought the wood, and I bought, the staple gun and the nails and all that. And for the next 3 days, that's all I did. Because that's what I was excited about doing after classes were over, and that's what I was thinking throughout the day. How can I, how soon can I get back to my dorm room to keep working on this thing? And that's what I was excited about. But for me and my excitement, wanting to get this new project done, what did that mean? I had neglected some other, probably more important things, like homework or relationships or friends or things like that, something that is far less or far more important than a little wooden project. I had dreams of putting this picture up above my future son's crib or something. By the way, Casey was not too fond of that. What a great addition to the nursery that would be. In my mind, anyway. But on a much more serious scale, this was the condition of these people. They had their own projects that they wanted to work on. They had their own lives that they wanted to build. And yet all the while they knew that God's house needed rebuilding, but they continued to forsake it for 16 years. Consider your ways, the Lord says. So what is God passionate about us doing right now? What has God called us to do? What has God called you to do? What is He interested in you pursuing first and foremost? Is it pursuing someone with the gospel? Is it reaching out to a fellow church member who's in need of some spiritual encouragement, some physical encouragement, or maybe a discipling relationship? Whatever it is, are you willing to say, Lord, give me a hammer and a nail and I'll go build your house. I'll go build your temple and further your kingdom. And I'm willing to put first things first. Haggai is a short book, and we've got one more chapter. And for this chapter, I want to give you 4 reasons why, according to the Lord here, that we should put first things first. That we should be building God's temple before our temple. Number 1, put first things first because God promises His presence. We've read this one verse 13 already. You can look back at it, of chapter 1. He says, Then spake Haggai, the Lord's messenger, in the Lord's message unto the people, saying, I am with you, saith the Lord. Now also look at chapter 2, verses 4 through 5. It says, Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, saith the Lord, and be strong, O Joshua, son of Josedech, the high priest, and be strong, all you people of the land, saith the Lord, and work, for I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts, according to the word that I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt. So my spirit remaineth among you. Fear ye not. He says, fear not. What would these people have to fear about rebuilding a temple? Well, actually, as I mentioned before, there was foreign opposition already giving them trouble. We find in the book of Ezra where he talks about their foreign neighbors not liking it so much that they wanted to build the temple. And it wasn't so much that they wanted to rebuild the temple. It was just that they wanted to build something big, something iconic that they could rally around and possibly in the future gather an army to oppose them. Maybe a rallying point. That's what they saw the temple as. So when these people heard that these nearby nations didn't like it so much that they wanted to rebuild the temple, they feared and they stopped. The remnant of the people were small and helpless. They didn't have much means of protection. They, not too long after, they had just put up the walls again in Nehemiah's day. But God says, fear not. Why? Because I am with you. My presence remains among you. When God calls us to do a job, I'm a firm believer that when He calls us, He gives us everything that we need to do that job. He equips us. My own personal testimony would reflect very naturally for this. When the Lord called me to full-time ministry back in 2011 at camp, I was scared out of my mind. There's no way I could ever stand up in front of people and talk. I was just like Moses. I was scared to speak. I had a slow tongue. I'd stutter at times. I was nervous. I was shy. But I also knew that what the Lord had called me to do, he would also equip me to do it. And he's started that work over these 4 years of college. He's continuing that work, and he'll probably continue with me until I die. But the Lord equips us for every job that he calls us to do, or else he wouldn't have called us to do it. He was with the slow of speech Moses. He said, I will be with your tongue. And then he provided Aaron to be a spokesperson. And when he called Israel into the wilderness, he didn't leave them a day without food. He promised Joshua that he would not forsake him. Therefore, be strong and courageous. And he provided for the people here his comforting presence so that they would fear not when they went back to rebuild the temple. Today, what do we have? We have the same promise. We have the Holy Spirit who indwells us. We have the very presence of God. He strengthens and comforts and equips us for the tasks that he calls us to do. So fear not. The promise that was given to the people in Haggai's day that God will be with you is the same promise that we can cling to today when we fear. I am with you. When a child sets out to ride a bike for the first time, what's the most encouraging and comforting thing he could ever have? It's having his father right behind him, encouraging him, saying that I'll catch you when you fall. Don't be afraid. I'm here. I'm with you. And that encourages him to not fear, to pedal harder, to go get the job done. The Lord has asked us to build his kingdom and to prioritize his work in our life today. You have the all-powerful, comforting, strengthening presence of God with you right now, so fear not. Number 2, put first things first because God is building something through your seemingly insignificant work. And it's something that we could never even imagine. Look at verse 3 of chapter 2. He says, who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? He's talking about the old temple. So who still is among you that has saw Solomon's temple before the exile? He says, how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison as nothing? So the older folks among the group looked at this new temple, and in its early stages, they knew right away that this was not going to even compare to the old temple, and they became discouraged. Look at verses 6 through 9 also of chapter 2. It says, for thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once, it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land. And I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come. And I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. So he says not to worry about the glory of the temple. For those older folks who were comparing, who were worried about what this new temple was going to look like compared to the old one, he says, don't worry. I own all the gold and the silver anyway. And I'm going to bring it in one day. He says, I'm going to shake the nations. I'm going to shake the earth and the dry land and the water. And all of that treasure is going to come back. Fear not. Don't worry. No matter where it is, he's going to bring it back. The tabernacle in Moses' day and the temple of Solomon's day both had something in common that this temple did not. And that was the Ark of the Covenant. That was God's presence with them. It was the most priceless treasure. And this was his glory. and that was the glory of the temple. Unfortunately, though, the ark during the 70 years of captivity was lost. They never got it back. So this new temple wouldn't have the Ark of the Covenant. It wouldn't have the glory that was filling that place in the former temple. So how can the glory be restored? How can God say in verse 9 that the glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former? And in this place will I give peace. How can he say that if the Ark of the Covenant is lost? It's not going to be put back in its normal place. This prophecy from the Lord in these verses remained unfulfilled for another 500 years until the Prince of Peace himself set foot in that new temple. Jesus himself. It was this very temple, expanded a little bit by King Herod, that the glory of God incarnate put his feet down on that soil under the name of Jesus Christ. So when God says that he was going to fill the glory of the temple again, it wasn't the way that these Jews had thought. It was something greater. It was something more glorious. It was his presence physically as he set foot in that temple. And folks, he's going to do it again. He's going to come again, and he's going to set foot down on this earth again. And when Christ sits on his throne, the desire of all nations will be where he sits. The people in Haggai's day wouldn't have thought this way. They were thinking, we need to bring in all the treasure again, all the gold and the silver, all the beautiful things that Solomon had decorated the temple with. That's where the glory is. But God had a different plan. He's going to put his own presence, his very incarnate Son, on the throne in the new temple. And that would be the glory. That would be the far exceeding glory of that former temple. And that's why he can say that this new temple is going to be far greater than that of the old. Because Jesus didn't go sit in Solomon's throne physically. But he will come and sit on the throne when he comes again, when he returns. And that was something far more greater than they could ever imagine. So what did they need to do? They needed to build the temple for this to happen. If they didn't build the temple, there would be no temple for Christ to come and set foot on. So their seemingly insignificant work was made significant by God. Because Christ set foot in that seemingly insignificant work. God always has a grand plan in mind. So when he calls us to do a job, he calls us to do a ministry or to a person, he is not limited by our finite visions of what we think might happen. Through our work, he is building something greater than we can imagine. You know, I look back and remember those great revivals in recent history. How could my leading this one person to Christ compare to that? How could my seemingly insignificant small prayers work on behalf of an entire family? I've seen God move in great ways, but how can what I do now compare to that? But that's not what God has called us to think on. For the Lord's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and his ways higher than ours. And he is able to work exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. So that person you lead to Christ might lead another person to Christ. And multiply. And multiply. And those prayers that you think are not being very effectual, the Lord may use in a great way. We all have testimony of how the Lord has worked as we have faithfully, consistently pursued in prayer. So be faithful. Put God's work first. Even if you think it seems insignificant, God is going to take it and do great things with it. He promises. Thirdly, put first things first because your worship is defiled when God's work is second place. Check out this message from Haggai in verses 10 through 14 of chapter 2. It says, in the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, came the word of the Lord to Haggai the prophet, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, ask now the priests concerning the law, saying, if one bear holy flesh in the skirt of his garment, and with his skirt do touch bread, or pottage, or wine, or oil, or any meat, shall it be holy? So he's saying, if I've got a holy piece of meat here, and I stick it in my pocket, and I brush up against, tomorrow's lunch, does that lunch become holy? Well, the priests answered and said, no. Verse 13. Then said Haggai, if one that is unclean by a dead body touch any of these, shall it be unclean? And the priests answered and said, it shall be unclean. Then answered Haggai and said, so is this people, and so is this nation before me, saith the Lord. And so is every work of their hands, and that which they offer there is unclean. So far, before Haggai's message, as we've discussed, there was only a foundation that was laid. There was an altar there, and they were sacrificing. But again, they had neglected the building of that temple. They had disobeyed the Lord. So even the worship that they brought in sacrifice to God had been defiled because of their disobedience. In a way, they had touched the dead body and brought it to the altar and tried to offer there a sacrifice. That's what he's saying. That because of their disobedience, their worship had now been defiled. And so today we have the same occurrence. We know that when we are in sin, we have a hindrance between us and our relationship with the Lord. Or when we're in open opposition to what God has called us to do, and we prioritize our passions and desires over His, our worship is robbed of the joy of an open and genuine relationship with God. And many of us, all of us, can attest to that at some point in our life. It's as if we come to the Lord ready to worship with a dirty and guilty conscience. And that's not fun. We've been there. We know that we've been declared righteous by Christ, that we've been washed clean, so our dirty hands don't keep us out of a relationship with God, but they do stifle it. For many Christians, the reason that they're not growing in their relationship with God and serving Him is because we have sin in our life. We avoid and neglect the work of God through the week, but then we want to come on Sunday and worship Christ. We suddenly want to be spiritual, but it can't work that way. When God has first place in our life, then our worship will be a natural continuation of what's already happening. And this is what the Lord is pointing to them to here in Haggai. He's saying, obey my word so that you can come to me and worship with a clean heart and a genuine relationship. Number 4, and lastly, put first things first because God always fulfills His promises. Look at the end of the book, verses 20 through 23. Chapter 2. And again, the word of the Lord came unto Haggai in the 24th day of the month, saying, Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I will shake the heavens and the earth, and I will overthrow the thrones of kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen, and I will overthrow the chariots and those that ride in them, and the horses and their riders shall come down, every one by the sword of his brother. In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, saith the Lord, and will make thee as a signet. For I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. Now these last few verses can leave you scratching your head a bit, unless you know two things. What is a signet, and who was Zerubbabel? Well, a signet that he's referring to here is like a signet ring. It's a ring that a king would wear to seal official documents. You remember in the book of Daniel when the leaders there were trying to pass a decree that anyone who prays to a god other than the king of Babylon would be put to death. And you remember he sealed that document with his signet. That would be like his official signature. We have many examples of this in modern day. We see that when we go to get a notary for when we register to vote. That imprinted seal that would come with the paper is like the equivalent of a signet ring. It's the official stamp of authority. For a king, this was evidence of royal authority and ownership. So when God says he is making Zerubbabel his signet ring, what does he mean? Well, that takes us to our second question. Who was Zerubbabel? Zerubbabel was the son of David 16 generations later. So when God declares Zerubbabel as his signet ring, he's saying that through Zerubbabel, he will stamp his authority on this world. And by this, he's saying that he is restoring the Davidic dynasty. The line of David has been restored. He's saying that he will keep and continue his Davidic promise and make his impression on the world through Zerubbabel. And that we know that if this is the line of David, who is coming? Jesus Christ. 11 generations later, we have born to Joseph and Mary the son of David, Jesus Christ, and the son of Zerubbabel. So God kept his promise and put his stamp of approval again on the Davidic line. Because during the exile, there was no Davidic king. There was no ruler in Israel of the Davidic line. So through this, he's saying, I am reestablishing my covenant with you. That a king is coming. A Messiah is coming. And he will come to bring peace. He will come to save. He will come to die. To forgive us of our sins. And be risen again. And that's what we celebrated here today. And so this is what God has started back in Zerubbabel's day. So the promise that we have today is that God is building his kingdom on earth. That's what he's passionate about. That's what he wants us to be pursuing and interested in. He wants us to be heavily involved in that. Jesus has promised to build his church. And he's promised to be with us. And he promised that he is coming again. Does what we focus our time and energy on portray a life that is living according to these promises? One that is pursuing the building of God's temple. So I don't know what the Lord has called you to today individually. I trust that the Spirit's working in your heart today. He calls us each individually to different things, but he's called us all corporately to one great commission. To build his kingdom. To build his temple. Go into all the world and make disciples, is what he said. So where do your priorities lie today? What comes first in your life? Are you building God's house or are you building yours? And will you be honest with yourself and the Lord today and commit by his grace to pursuing his work first? Let's close with a word of prayer.